Thank you very much for that kind introduction. I'm terribly honored to be here today, to be here both as part of this unveiling of the Global Knowledge Platform, but also to be here at this great institution that celebrates the power of ideas, the power of knowledge to make lives better. The first work that I ever did on cities outside of the United States was in Latin America. And I cannot tell you how happy it makes me to be here in this great city, to experience both the promise and the challenges that cities like Bogota have. Let me start with a picture of America. And I want to apologize that perhaps this speech will be a little bit too American-centered, but I believe many of the pieces of information extend outside the United States. This is a picture of America from the last census. So we just had the recent figures from the 2010 census released. And those figures were actually not in the book, but conveniently they conveyed many of the same things that I had said before knowing the data. The blue line shows the relationship between median income in the year 2000 and population density across counties in the United States. Each one of those dots is 1/10 of America's counties. And as you can see, as you get denser and denser, you have higher and higher incomes across America's counties. This is a similar phenomenon that's found throughout the world. It's called agglomeration economies, typically, the connection between productivity and coming together. Another way of thinking about this is the three largest metropolitan areas within the United States include only 13% of the country's population, while producing 18% of America's gross domestic product. And if the rest of America rose to the per capita productivity levels seen in the New York metropolitan area, America's GDP would go up by 43%. The top line shows population growth. It shows the rise in population growth with density. So far from spreading out from the dense corridors of the America's cities, as we once did, we have increasingly come together in those cities that are the economic heartland, both of the United States and of the world. Cities are not just productive within developed countries. They're productive throughout the world. We've recently, of course, just passed that remarkable halfway point where more than 50% of humanity now lives in cities. And I believe that's a very good thing, because if you compare those countries where more than 50% of the population is urbanized to those less urbanized countries, the more urbanized countries have on average incomes that are 5 times higher and infant mortality levels that are less than a third of the less urbanized countries. Obviously, this is not just about causality. It's not just about the fact that cities necessarily make people more productive. But cities are clearly part of the development process. They're part of the pathway from poverty to prosperity. And within countries, we do in fact have extremely good statistical work that's been going on over the past 30 years, where we really do believe that this is not just a random correlation, that in fact people who come to cities actually see their wages go up dramatically, often over time, as you see a faster wage going on in cities, which is, I think, compatible with the view that cities are very much forges of human capital, places where people learn from one another and become more skilled. The graph that I've put up here, though, is not actually about income at all. It's about self-reported life satisfaction. And I think it's often taken to be the case that there's something so benign about rural living that, you know, it's a terrible thing that people have left the farms and moved to urban areas. Well, the people who think that have clearly never been to a farm in a developing country. Because, in fact, these lives are not bucolic and pleasant like some Wordsworth poem, but, in fact, they're very hard lives, and cities really are. Within developing countries, people who live in cities typically say that they're significantly happier than people who live outside of cities. Now, the success, the dynamism, the power of cities in the modern world raises something of a paradox. We live in an age in which it is effortless to telecommute across the planet, in which we could all occupy whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia. Let's let the translators have fun with that one. Whatever sylvan spot appeals to our biophilia, and just dial it in. And yet, we've chosen cities. We continue to move to cities, and our cities are in so many dimensions more healthy, more vibrant, more productive than ever. And this is visible in high income levels, rising populations, high property values, and it's even clearer in the developing world. Gandhi once said, the growth of the nation, meaning India, depends not on cities, but on its villages. Oh, thank you, that's wonderful. With all due respect, the great man was wrong. The future of India does not depend on its villages. The future of India is very much being made in its cities, in places like Bangalore. And these are two images of Bangalore today. On your left is the Mindtree campus. Mindtree is a very successful software consulting firm, a place that is crammed full of smart Indian engineers who come together and learn from each other. On any given day, the top of that building, the rooftop, will be filled with the workers of this industry, up from the boss down to the very bottom, all of whom are connecting with each other, learning with each other, desperately trying to figure out good ideas to make them productive. But it's also a place where on a given day you'll run into representatives of the global economy connecting with these smart people in Bangalore. You'll run into Singapore investors or software experts from Silicon Valley, or even the occasional socially awkward Harvard professor. And this type of place, this Mindtree campus, is what is actually fueling the success of the messier world of Bangalore outside, and that's what you see on the right side. And I put that there for two reasons, one of which is we don't want to ever sugarcoat or underestimate the challenges that cities like Bangalore continue to face. But on the other hand, they are more than just shiny software spots. They are also places in which ordinary people find a living by providing services to the people who then work in these software companies. And that's absolutely crucial to the success and to the transformation of India and of every poorer country moving out of poverty into prosperity. Now, this relatively benign view of cities, this hopeful view, this triumphant view, is in fact quite different from the urban view of my youth, quite different from the cities of my youth. And these are two iconic images from when I was a kid growing up in New York City 30 years ago. This image is of President Ford turning New York down when it asked for a fiscal bailout. He didn't actually tell New York City to drop dead, but I think he probably meant it. And indeed, it looked during this era that not just President Ford, but history itself was telling the older, colder cities of America and of Europe that they were headed for the trash heap of history. The top image is of President Jimmy Carter wandering through the wasteland that was the South Bronx, a place which had once been a thriving area where less advantaged New Yorkers could live and afford housing and be connected to a thriving great metropolis. There it's a wasteland, a place where civilization has fled. Now, during this era, it was very easy to believe that cities were gone forever because the forces that had made them productive had ceased to be relevant. America's cities grew up as nodes on a great transportation network that made the wealth of the American hinterland accessible to the markets of the East and to Europe. The same thing is true of many Latin American cities. The story of Buenos Aires in the late 19th century is eerily familiar relative to the story of Chicago, both as places where frigorificos, refrigerated transportation, moved beef to the markets of the East, the markets of Europe. The problem at the start of the 19th century that cities ended up solving was that both North and South America had fabulously wealthy interiors that were essentially inaccessible. In 1816, it cost as much to move goods 30 miles over land as it did to ship them across the Atlantic. Over the course of the next 50 years, Americans built, both North and South, built a great transportation network. They built the Erie Canal, the Illinois and Michigan Canal, railroads then complemented those canals, and cities grew up as nodes on that canal. Chicago was the linchpin on a great watery arc that went all the way from New York to New Orleans. Every one of the 20 largest cities in the United States in 1900 was on a major waterway, from the oldest, Boston and New York, typically where the river meets the sea, to the newest, Minneapolis, on the northernmost navigable point on the Mississippi River. And then industry grew up around these ports, around these rail yards. In New York, for example, the three dominant New York industries in the 19th century were sugar refining, garment production, and printing and publishing. All of these industries, like finance, which now is so dominant in New York, are children of the port. Sugar refining was natural because there was so much raw sugar that was coming in through New York Harbor as a result of the Caribbean trade. Garment production was so natural because textiles were such a big item that was being shipped between the old world and the new through New York. And printing and publishing is my favorite story because, in fact, it reminds us that some things never change. But the big money in 19th century American printing and publishing was in pirated English novels. The novels of Dickens and Scott, where no American would bother to pay any form of copyright fee to the authors. Now, if you don't have property rights, if you don't have copyright, you've got to print first. It's the only chance that you actually have of actually having some control of the market. So it's really crucial to get the latest book before any of your competitors do. And this is why New York's port gave it an edge, because the Harper brothers, later of Harper and Row, dominant New York City publishers, got the latest Sir Walter Scott novel, got Peveril of the Peak, before it showed up in Philadelphia, days before, at their competitors in Philadelphia, Carey and Lee. Now, of course, you're looking at the image of perhaps the greatest industry that grew up around Chicago's great rail yards, the stockyards, right? This shows, more than anything else, the role of cities as moving the great wealth of the American hinterland. The, rich, dark soil of Iowa, the Tama, which is then, used to produce corn, tremendously fertile area, something like a 30 to 40% increase in the productivity of the soil and moving from the older areas of America to Iowa. That corn is, of course, then fed to cows and pigs, who are then moved to Chicago, where they're slaughtered and put on rail cars shipped east. That name Armour, who was one of the two great magnates of the stockyard business, is important because he's a transportation pioneer as well as a great slaughterer of animals. He's actually the guy who came up with implementing the refrigerated rail cars. And the great idea in refrigerated rail cars was putting the ice on the top so it would melt down and keep the beef cold with the melting water rather than below the beef dripping down. Seems obvious now, but many good ideas often do. Now, the remarkable thing about cities, of course, is that even when they form for utterly mundane purposes, even when they form to get the corn-fed cows to the rail yards and get them east, remarkable things happen when smart people come together and learn from one another. We have been witnessing this, the chains of collaborative creativity in cities since Socrates and Plato bickered on an Athenian street corner. Cities have shown a remarkable ability to enrich our culture. Take, for example, Florence in the 15th century, where a chain starts off with Brunelleschi's ability to understand linear perspective, who passes it along to his close friend Donatello, who uses it in low-relief sculpture. He passes it along to his friend Masaccio, who puts it on a painting on the wall of the Brancacci Chapel, who passes it along to his student, his friend, that less than saintly monk, Fra Filippo Lippi, who passes along to his friend Botticelli, and so forth. Smart person borrowing an idea from another smart person, riffing on each other's ideas, and coming up with something that is, in the end, truly magical. Well, a similar thing happens in Chicago in the 1880s, where a cluster of brilliant architects come together to take advantage of the opening of the West and the opportunities created by the burning of the city in the Chicago fire. What you're looking at is often claimed to be the world's first skyscraper. It is the home insurance building built by William LeBaron Jenney, architect. He is often given credit as being the father of the skyscraper. But in fact, there's a lively architectural debate about whether or not he deserves this credit, or indeed whether or not this building deserves the credit as the first skyscraper. A skyscraper, of course, is a tall building kept up by either a steel or cast iron frame, cast iron skeleton. So exclude buildings like St. Pancras Station in London, which are held up by vast masonry walls. But this building only has two walls that are held up by steel or cast iron. The back two walls, the party walls, have traditional masonry-bearing walls. And indeed, the ideas about the skyscraper were being circulated in Chicago by other architects other than Jenney at exactly the same time. But in fact, looking for a single father or mother of the architect of the skyscraper misses the point. Like every one of humanity's greatest inventions, there is a series of people, all of whom stood on each other's shoulders and collectively came up with the new thing. Other people who have been put forward as being the parent of the skyscraper, Daniel Burnham, Louis Sullivan, they worked as apprentices in Jenney's office. Other people, Holabard, Roche, who were part of this cluster of architectural genius, they were all connected with each other. They all learned from each other. They all stole each other's ideas. And it is very much true that the skyscraper is not the child of Jenney, it's the child of Chicago. It's the child of this urban ability to enable people to learn from one another. And that is why cities are so important in generating the new ideas that have fueled human civilization in the past and will fuel our progress in the future. Now, a similar cluster of genius was happening in Detroit at the same time period. Detroit, of course, was also a great inland port. Detroit,